You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. Hi, and welcome back to the Economics Detective Podcast. I'm Garrett Peterson, and today I'm going to be interviewing Michael McCullough of the University of California, San Diego. Michael, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks, Garrett. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. So Michael's the author of a new book entitled The Kindness of Strangers, How a Selfish Ape Invented a New Moral Code. It's, I'm going to say it's a very ambitious book trying to sort of explore and explain, how humans can be altruistic, how they can, be kind to one another when we don't necessarily see that in all animals or even in many animals outside of, eusocial insects. It kind of engages with the whole scope of human history from our evolutionary origins to the invention of agriculture all the way up to the modern day. So I'm excited to talk about it. Michael, do you want to start by telling me a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book?
Sure. I'm a psychologist. I teach and do research. I have a laboratory. And I've always been interested, really through my entire career, in pro-social behavior. I started working early on, back in the 90s, on how people forgive and, forgive harms that have happened to them. And this is a topic that a lot of clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists had shown an interest in. I'm actually trained as a counseling psychologist, but I was always interested in social psychology. So I went to some of the existing, social psychology literature to figure out what people had to say about pro-social behavior, because it seemed to me that forgiving involved, replacing in some sense, feelings of vindictiveness and anger with something more conciliatory or friendly. So I wanted to understand pro-social behavior back then. A few years later, I got quite interested in gratitude, which struck me again as being, in some ways, not exactly a mirror image, but maybe the end of a spectrum that it shares on the other pole with forgiveness, which is about pro-social behavior in response to pro-social behavior. We treat someone kindly because of how they've treated us. So from there, I took an interest, a few years later in cooperation and altruism. I started reading a lot of evolutionary psychology, actually. And so I got quite interested in this so-called puzzle of cooperation, which you outlined really nicely in your introduction. From there, I was a laboratory evolutionary psychologist working on cooperation. But at some point, it seemed to me that my colleagues in evolutionary science broadly were asking a lot of what we knew from evolutionary science about the evolution of cooperation when they tried to use those models to explain modern day, contemporary forms of large-scale pro-social behavior. They were tempted to use it to explain why we show an interest in our friends or people we maybe mistake for our friends. But I thought it was quite hazardous to begin to extend those models to things like supporting social welfare projects or contributions to UNICEF or any of the charitable contributions to organizations in our communities. So I thought it was going to be more important to understand, a broader, to embrace a much broader set of insights from not just laboratory psychology and social science, but also I needed to understand history and I needed to understand philosophy and ethics. And that's really was the inspiration for the book, trying to come to grips with a question, which is why we care today about the welfare and well-being of people, in fact, we'll never meet.
Yeah, there's a big gap between early human what we call an anatomically modern human, someone who maybe lived 100,000 years ago, not in an apartment building, not in a society with billions of members, not not in a complex modern economy, and just sort of explaining, okay, why does this person cooperate with the other people in their tribe? Why do they maybe cooperate with the people in another tribe sometimes, possibly? Um, and then, it's a leap from there to, like you said, donating to UNICEF today. You certainly can't explain the latter without understanding the former. And we don't we don't ask the same when we're trying to explain why animals behave a certain way, why they would behave a different way in a totally or a similar or a different way in a totally alien environment that is very much unlike the one they evolved in.
It's true that what we're seeing in the modern world with regard to our concern for strangers really is evolutionarily novel. We've never confronted situations where we had the ability or frankly, any interest in helping people clear on the other side of the planet. That's just never something, it's unique that we even have the ability to contact or communicate or know about the problems of people on the other side of the planet. So what we're doing is truly evolutionarily novel. Because we didn't exist in a world where that made any sense or was possible. In fact, if anything, helping strangers, true strangers, was deeply fitness lowering for our ancestors, many tens of thousands of years ago. So we are confronting a new environment. Animals today always, regularly confront new environments, and they are really using evolved instincts to try to cope with those environments. And so those instincts they use can end up looking sort of silly in the things that they cause animals to do in in this contemporary world, because they're facing stimuli, conditions of their environments that are totally novel, and yet they've got these ancient brains trying to make sense of their worlds and help the owners of those brains, to make a living in their environments.
You mentioned a true stranger, and I believe you're alluding to the idea that helping another person who's maybe a brother or a cousin, someone who shares some amount of your genes, is very easily explained by evolutionary psychology. That if a person shares your genes, then helping them to be more reproductively fit also helps you be, is like helping yourself to a lesser extent. But yes, a true stranger, someone who shares very few of your genes, whose nearest common ancestor might be thousands of years back. That's the part that's difficult to explain.
No, that's quite right. We've known for a century that a gene inside of an evolving creature that causes it to help its genetic relatives, who are also likely to share that gene for helping, that gene can go up in frequency in the population if the helping it causes its owner to do creates a huge benefit for genetic relatives, because those genetic relatives are likely to have that helping gene. So when a gene causes you to help other copies of itself in other people's bodies, even if that gene in you is costing you, it's doing something that lowers your fitness, like causing you to babysit your brother's children or your sister's children, or causing you to care for your brothers and sisters more directly, or in fact, really to care for your own offspring when you could be out carousing and partying and finding new reproductive opportunities for yourself. That gene can nevertheless go up in frequency and be the subject of natural selection. So we have this ability to understand how our concern for our loved ones evolved. It evolved because it could create copies of itself and promote their fitness, even while they were lowering the fitness of the helper. So that's well worked out stuff. We've known that formally since the 1960s. And helping friends as well is something that we evolved to do, and we understand sort of the evolutionary conditions in which helping individuals can pay off for you if it promotes a psychology in them, a psychological response that in the future will motivate them to help you in return. That's called reciprocity. But when we're, as you say, when we're faced with people from completely different groups, these are different cultural groups, these are different ethnic groups, the mind really doesn't. There's no real scope for regard for others to evolve. We don't know of any evolutionary models that can explain that. And in part, that's because outside of our own ethnic, linguistic, cultural group, we probably evolved to regard people like that with horror or fear or terror or hostility rather than some interest in their welfare in a positive sense. I mean, we might be interested in their welfare, but it's in lowering their welfare rather than raising it. So that is an evolutionary puzzle.
Right. So you encounter another very distant tribe, very different from you, and it's in the prehistoric human evolutionary times, and they're competing with you for resources for the most part. They're mostly a threat. They eat the same things you do, and they need the same things to survive. So there's absent a sort of developed system whereby we can trade for mutual gain. It's not unreasonable to see outsiders as more of a threat than members of your own tribe. Do you want to? You quote in the book quote from Richard Dawkins saying that we have sexual desire because sex leads to procreation and children, and yet even if you know that, and yet we still have sexual desire when someone, say, on birth control pills, and it can't lead to children, and that's. And similar, he's drawing an analogy to sort of altruism that, if there's an evolutionary reason to be altruistic, even if that reason is gone, even if in a context where you actually don't evolutionarily benefit or raise your own fitness by doing the same thing, you might still do it, or you might still have that evolutionary drive because it's similar enough, because in the ancestral environment, this edge case wasn't accounted for. So do you agree with Dawkins' assessment there?
Yeah, that's an insight that's been really influential in evolutionary science, evolutionary social science. And what he's pointing to is a concept that we now refer to in, I think, a cute way as misfiring. So the idea is that, again, you move into a world that you didn't evolve in, and the social circumstances have changed. And yet you have these mechanisms, these mental mechanisms operating all the time that haven't changed. And so in a sense, what they believe about your world is that you're still in the world that they evolved in. So what Dawkins is suggesting, that we have mechanisms that cause us to care for friends and strangers. These very mechanisms I talked about, mechanisms for caring for your, sort of altruistically caring for your genetic relatives, and also for caring for friends who might have the ability and the interest in repaying you in the future. Misfiring happens. We know it happens regularly. My favorite example outside of humans is a creature called the marmot, which evolved on prairies and grasslands to avoid wolves. That's its main predator. So in some of the areas where where hunters killed off all the wolves over the past century, there aren't any more wolves, but there still are marmots. And what you can actually make happen, and field biologists have done this, and I think probably to their great amusement, they've done experiments where they've actually put two-dimensional, stand-ups of wolves in these marmots' territories that they evolved in. So you're just, sort of like you might stand next to a 6-foot stand-up of the Queen or Donald Trump and take a picture. These stand-ups have been put out. They're still afraid of them. They see these two-dimensional portrayals of wolves, and they act as if they're interacting with real live wolves. So if you step back and you're an alien and you see this, you think, well, these marmots are idiots. They're running away from this, two-dimensional portrayal of a creature that, as far as they know, that they've never encountered. But their minds don't know that wolves don't exist anymore. What their minds know is when you see that stimulus, what you're supposed to do is flee, run and hide. So a perfectly good mechanism operating in this new world where wolves don't exist still believe that wolves are out there, and they can be tripwired. They have tripwires, and they can be sort of fooled, if you like, into misfiring, executing behaviors that are, from a God's eye view, are kind of dumb looking. And so Dawkins wants to argue that we've got the same, that with our mechanisms for comedy and concern and altruism for friends and family are getting activated when we encounter brand new strangers, people on the street, people we might tip in a restaurant that we'll never see again. And that these are sort of, we're helpless to the appeal of aiding somebody in those conditions, because we don't know what it is to never meet somebody again. If you meet somebody now, chances are really good you will meet them in the future. So Dawkins really likes this misfiring argument, and a lot of other evolutionary social scientists have been charmed by it as well over the past couple of decades.
Are there alternative explanations that you think sort of compete with the misfire argument or complement it?
Yes, I actually think, and this is part of what dissatisfied me and made me want to take a broader view, the view I take in The Kindness of Strangers. The mechanisms that we possess to motivate us to care for family and friends are actually quite intelligent. They're quite smart at doing what they need to do and restraining themselves from doing things that would be dumb from a fitness point of view. For example, you cannot really fool someone into believing that a non-family member is in fact a family member. And the reason for that is, like a lot of vertebrates, we figure out who for example, our siblings are on the basis of having lived under the same roof with them for 10, 12, 15 years. And the more time you spend, going to sleep with someone in the same bed or waking up and eating Cheerios with them in the morning, the more and more certain your mind becomes that they are your first degree relative, that person is your brother or your sister. The mind also figures out who your siblings are on the basis of a really simple but incredibly reliable rule that if your mom is providing food to that other creature, it's probably a sibling, because moms, if you're around to watch your mom doing this with someone that's not you, evolutionarily, that was a really reliable cue that individual was your sibling. So the sibling recognition system evolved to lock onto those cues, which means you can't trick it very easily. In fact, they are trickable, but what you have to do is put unrelated people together day in and day out, going to sleep and waking up together and being bathed together and eating their Cheerios together over lots and lots of time. And when you do that, you get people who really genuinely love their adoptive siblings, or you get a really deep desire to help the other children that you grew up with on a kibbutz, for example. So these are exceptions that prove the rule. Our systems for altruism toward kin are really, really picky. They're not dummies. They have fail safes and idiot proofings that prevent them from being tricked. And the same applies to our instincts for reciprocity. We are very, very picky about who we will provide benefits to on the prospect of getting return benefits. And really what we're always evaluating when someone comes to us with a need is, can we imagine a situation in which they will be in a position to repay us again in the future? And perhaps more importantly, when that time comes, will they be willing to or interested in providing a benefit to us? So we're interested in whether people are willing and whether they're able. And we condition our helping on those characteristics. So that's how these evolved systems work. And when we encounter needy strangers, for this, for those reasons, we're not likely to repay them. We're not likely to help them because of evolved reciprocity and kin altruism systems. There's something else going on, I would contend, and that is really what I spend most of the book trying to explain is if it's not coming from those kinds of instincts, where is it coming from? Because I don't think those mechanisms get the job done because they're smart systems. They evolved to be smart.
You're saying if we were explaining the altruism entirely through helping your kin because they share your genes, or helping your non-kin because they might reciprocate your help, how do we explain helping non-kin who almost certainly won't ever be in a position to reciprocate? The beggar on the street who you probably will never ever see again.
Right. So that is really the project that I undertook. On one hand, we know that people have all other kinds of motivations that arise when they encounter face-to-face needs. We are motivated by empathy. And empathy does cause us to take an interest in other people's welfare. But at the same time, empathy is something we actively avoid when we can. And I would, among economists, I think James Andreoni has done a better job than many in really illustrating this. Andreoni and his colleagues. Do you know about the Salvation Army experiment that they did?
Oh, it's familiar, but explain.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's certainly one of my favorite studies. Not only in sort of the social science of altruism, but also in economics. They set up some Salvation Army bell ring. You have the Salvation Army in Canada, obviously, right?
Yep.
So every Christmas, as you probably know, the Salvation Army sends bell ringers out to grocery stores and shopping malls with a pot, and they ring the bell and they try to encourage people to, put some money into these pots that they collect and then use to care for the poor. So people do, as you can certainly see when you go to the store, people do stop and they put money in. But what James did was created a situation in which it was possible to avoid these solicitations by putting the bell ringer in front of one entrance to the grocery store and very far from the entrance to the other entrance. So his question was, are people choosing that second door, the more remote door, at a level greater than chance? And he found that people actively were going out of their way to avoid this ask. And through the magic of economics that frankly are beyond me, he was actually able to estimate the amount of money people were willing to pay in terms of time and effort in order to avoid avoid the ask. How much inconvenience were people willing to bear in order to avoid having to stop and experience empathy and maybe the guilt of saying no. And I can't remember how much the amount was, but I remember it being something on the order of $1.13 or something like that. You can look it up. But the bottom line is people like money. They like their money, and they on average are going out of their way to avoid being solicited. So we can see a couple of motivations at work there. Yes, when you're approached by someone in need, you find you can find this compelling and persuasive. But I think every single one of us has had the experience of turning away from need situations because there's other things we like. We like our time and we like our money, and we don't like the feeling of guilt when we turn away from needs. So yeah, I think in the modern day we have other explaining to do other than that these misfiring arguments simply don't cover. And in particular, not just these day-to-day people you meet in the streets and, maybe we'll give $1, $2, or $5 or something like that. But also, one of the things that's really intriguing are the ways in which we are sometimes willing to help people that we don't meet face to face. And so there's both. I mean, I think both are really fascinating. What do we do when we are encountering a flesh and blood human being who needs help? And also these sorts of notional strangers that are out there, but you're not necessarily going to ever meet or know their names, and certainly they'll never be in a place to reciprocate you directly. So both are really puzzling. I mean, I think the stopping on the streets to help someone is puzzling because we have all kinds of incentives that work against it, and I think especially puzzling is why we have any compulsion or conviction at all to invest in the lives of people that we truly will never meet. They're kind of ideas rather than people.
It's really interesting that there's this higher order strategy that that the person asking you for a charitable donation is going to have an effect on you, and if only that you'll feel bad saying no, and so you can avoid it entirely. You being one step removed, being before you're there next to them, you can make a choice to just avoid seeing them. Just like if there's a documentary about suffering in the world, and you can just choose not to watch it, and then it's fine. You don't have to worry about that suffering. Whereas if you did watch it, you'd feel compelled to do something. So that's a very sort of interesting hint at the nature of these sort of altruistic feelings.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, we often model social behavior as a game between the self, direct welfare, direct, effects on well-being to you, costs to you, and benefits to another individual. And we want to think about, well, given that people will give a little money to another person, like, for example, I mean, I'm sure you and your listeners are really familiar with something like the Dictator game, right? A classic, maybe the canonical tool of experimental economists for studying pro-social behavior in the lab. The average person does share, if you give them $1, the average person is going to share, sort of 30 or 40 cents of that dollar with a complete stranger. And it's been common to model a behavior like that in terms of how much you value yourself and then how much you value the other person, or how much concern you have for equity. So norms about moral norms, and also regard for the welfare of another person. And then obviously there's, your own, your regard for your own welfare, which is the 60 cents you keep for yourself. But there's a higher order. So that's a game. We can think about that as a game, but there's a higher order game going on as well, I think. And this is what's quite surprising, is that there's another game, which is the way you are trying to depict yourself in the world. So in the experimental context, and this may be a case of misfiring, actually. You believe you're playing a game that involves your moral image within the experimental context. I mean, you don't want to seem like a jerk. You don't want to seem stingy. You don't want to seem like somebody who is just a misanthrope. So part of your behavior at that first order game is in the service of a second order game, which is trying to maintain a positive moral reputation for yourself among people who are curious about what you're going to do in that first order game. So we have other egoistic concerns as well. Concerns with seeming like a decent, good person. And so those have to be factored in as well into, any act of altruism that we might see in the world.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Dictator game. That's a game where an experimenter gives you $1 or $10, and you have to decide how much to share with another experimental participant. And that's really relevant because, of course, economists have done many different versions of the dictator game, and in one version where the experimenters go to great lengths with sliding envelopes under doors and like to assure the participants that they are fully anonymous and no one will know what choice they made. When they do that, people do give less. So it speaks to the idea that it's the idea you're being watched, that someone might observe you being, giving $0 to another person when you had a chance to share. That drives that. Although people do still give positive amounts, it's just less than they would have.
Right. They give less, and actually there are. I think the more obsessive compulsive the researchers are at framing out these possible second order effects, the more and more the giving goes down. In my own laboratory, as a matter of fact, a few years ago, with the psychologist William McCullough, who was a PhD student of mine, we went to extraordinary lengths to give subjects the belief that no one would be able to tell. In fact, we tried to create a situation in which the opportunity to donate was something that they had to discover. For the fact that they could help a needy person or another, a stranger, was something they had to discover for themselves. The opportunity to give was there in front of them, but they actually had to take advantage of it. So you were passing notes with another person and using an envelope, and the experimenter told you, you can put anything you want in this envelope, anything. You can put a note, or you can draw a picture, or you can put these pens and paper, on your desk, or you can put a piece of candy in the envelope. Anything you want. Anything you want is the implication. Could you put your shirt in there? Sure, put your shirt. Would you like to put a shoe in there? Go for it. And they had money. They'd been paid for their participation in the study, and they'd been told that only one subject was going to be paid that day, and it was the experiment. They were going to be paid, but the other subject wasn't going to be paid. So there was this inequity, and they had the opportunity to do something to, exercise any pro-social preference that they actually had. And when we set the situation up like that, people either did not discover, they weren't motivated to realize, hey, I have this conduit for getting money to this other person who doesn't have any because it was given all to me. Either they weren't curious enough to realize this, or having realized it, they just decided, well, I've got enough plausible deniability here that I can hang on to the $10 myself, and I can always just, appeal to ignorance. If someone were to ask me, hey, why didn't you share your money? I can just say, oh, I had no idea. I didn't realize it. So either their minds didn't notice because the minds weren't truly motivated by the desire to restore restore equity, or having noticed it, they realized, well, I like $10 a lot more than I like $7, and at the level of this higher order game, I can just plead ignorance and then hang on to my moral reputation while I also hang on to my $10. So I think, unfortunately, we haven't published this yet, but I think, that along with a couple of other studies suggest when you get really super stringent, you can make most of that dictator game giving go away, which I think is consistent with the true regard we have for the welfare of a complete stranger.
Right. So in a normal dictator game, I, the researcher, stand over you and say, how much money do you want to give to this other person? Or usually the computer screen says that, but it's always framed as, how much money do you want to give, right? And so it's the idea of giving money is seeded to you from the start, and that the researchers are going to be looking for how much money you or the pool of participants are giving, and so your experiment, they had that choice, but but it wasn't you know it wasn't hinted to them. The experimenter didn't you as the experimenter didn't like tell them that was what you were looking for, and so that and they were much less likely to give money, and that's interesting. This idea of being observed, of sort of your moral reputation, that an observer might think that you're a good person if they see you giving the money, or they might judge you less harshly if you don't give the money but have an excuse like ignorance. That this reminds me a lot of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, which you do reference in the book. How would you say your theory relates to Adam Smith's?
Well, Smith, like David Hume, really put a lot of emphasis on sympathy. And his idea being that if you take the trouble to kind of consider how another person is feeling, so Hume, like Smith, suggested that we, probably a psychology that's pretty close to being correct. You take in images of another person. You see the world; it goes into your eyes, and you see another person suffering, or you see somebody who needs some money, or who's asking for some help, or who is struggling in the streets, or something along those lines. And it goes in as just a fact. It's just a bare social fact. And when you then imagine how you would feel in that situation, the image is converted into an impression, by which they meant it is suddenly exerting force inside you, like the impression of your finger on a piece of paper when you're giving a fingerprint or whatever. Then it affects you. Then it's like a passion. And then you're going to consider, how would I, given that this is how this, I'm touched by this person suffering. And so you're going to ask yourself, given that this is how I feel when I imagine myself in this situation, how would I want to be treated, or what would make me feel better? And then you're motivated to do something to help. But so they have this idea floating around, and it exists as I think one of the major, hugely influential, perennial ideas in moral philosophy and moral psychology. It's sympathy that motivates pro-social behavior. I think where this model actually ends up falling short is that it does explain why we help friends and loved ones. But in the laboratory, when we actually study empathy for complete strangers or members of other racial groups, for example, or our competitors and other activities, there is no sympathy, there is no compassion. So again, it ends up looking like sympathy and compassion are proximate causes for helping other people. But as soon as we frame the interaction as an interaction between members of coalitional groups that we don't belong to, or competitors, then suddenly that empathy goes away. It's like the mind doesn't even bother to, do this conversion from ideas to impressions. So there again, it looks like this, the psychology of the stranger isn't very good at generating pro-social behavior when that stranger is someone that you dislike or you feel different from.
Yeah, and you reference Adam Smith's little finger it's actually the title of one of your chapters, which is a reference to in the theory of moral sentiments. He has this sort of passage where he talks about, what if all of China was swallowed up by an earthquake? And, writing this in the 1700s, China's very far away. So you spend months on a boat to get there. And people are aware that it's there and that there are lots of people there, but, have almost no connection to them whatsoever. And he says that, a person would read about it and express, concern, and be, what a horrible thing. But they would sleep just fine that night, and they would forget about it shortly. Whereas if they lost their little finger, if their pinky finger got cut off, they would be much more upset. Even though millions of people dying is objectively much worse than one person losing their finger. You know, if it happens to you, you know, or someone very close to you, there's a scaling effect that, you know, it's not that you completely don't care about all the people in China. It's just that you know, it the the scale of it falls away. The farther away from you and the less connected you are personally to it, the less you care. Do you agree with Smith's assessment there?
Oh yes, yes, and Smith's position is even more dismal than you let on, because he says if you knew your finger was going to be cut off the next morning, so it's still just an idea in your mind. It's the finger has not been removed yet, amputated yet. You wouldn't sleep at all that night. I mean, obviously that's true. That's true of all of us. And so you don't even need to lose the finger for, to feel, just absolute terror at the loss of your fourth digit. But having learned that 1 million people on the other side of the earth have been swallowed up by this earthquake, it's happened. It's already taken place. It's not the prospect of it happening. You sleep fine. As he says, you might reflect on, the impermanence of life, or the unfairness of, of the, lots we have in life. You think about this and reflect, then you go to bed, and just you sleep soundly and have, lovely dreams. So he's really pointing to, I think, also that this psychology of the stranger needs something else. He wants to rescue it with empathy, which is awesome. But the problem is, as we've seen, empathy is really fickle. It acts as if it's what it's really built to do is motivate us to care for our loved ones, our friends, and maybe our co-tribes person. People who are members of our own ethnic and cultural groups. So it does some explanatory work, but I don't think it gets us too far in explaining, why we might be trying to eliminate malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or, trying to, bring agriculture, a really vibrant agriculture or, industrial economy to, Congo, for example. Though that it seems you need stronger explanatory stuff or something like that.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, this is an ambitious book. It doesn't just talk about human evolution, but also kind of takes a big look at human history as well. Going from our earliest days as just another ape to the development of agriculture all the way up to the modern day. So let's talk about when humans stopped living in small tribes of didn't stop, but when they went from living in some places in small tribes of 100 people to, larger settled societies with thousands and, eventually hundreds of thousands and then millions of people. Developing agriculture and social structures, much beyond our tribal origins. How does your story about sympathy and compassion for strangers change as our living conditions change?
Right. When our ancestors moved into the first cities, they began to encounter something really unique, which was being surrounded by clouds and clouds of strangers, people that they have never interacted with, who they're not likely to get the benefits of reciprocity from interacting with, who are not genetic relatives or members of their lineage. And in those first farming-based sedentary societies, luck was going to end up making a bigger and bigger difference in how you fared and how you thrived, and also how your distant future generations of yours within your lineage were going to thrive. So we see a big explosion of inequality within these first cities. There's always been inequality, but it was much, what Rousseau called natural inequality, the inequality that comes from, some people being smarter than others or some being more, stronger than others. That began to change into a much deeper, sort of permanent, heritable social inequality. And actually, what it gave rise to was the first forms of, sort of systematic exploitation of the poor. You see in, the ancient cities of, Sumerian cities. You see evidence in at least in the ancient legal codes, that it was possible for people who were widowed or orphaned to have to go into long periods of debt slavery, to mortgage away their resources, their homes, even their clothing at exorbitant interest rates, and to be forced into debt slavery or prostitution. And reformers, the ancient god kings of these ancient cities, realized that they had an incentive. There was a personal incentive for them to try to take actions that would make these exploited classes better off. So they limited the terms of debt slavery. They limited interest rates you could charge. If you took somebody's, if someone pawned their stuff to you, as it were, for, the money to buy food and housing, you had to make it possible for them to buy that stuff back from you in the future, and so forth. So this, I think, is really our first insight into the kinds of institutions that we began to build to protect the vulnerable, to protect the poor and needy. As soon as we started being, city folk. From there, I try to take the book through, 6 other periods in history, including the Axial Age, when we see the classical Indus River Valley societies, which, gave us Hinduism, and Yellow River Society that gave us Confucianism, ancient Israel and classical Greece. All of these societies seem to have discovered the Golden Rule, oddly enough, within just a few hundred years of each other. They provide the idea that a spiritually fulfilled life involves compassion for the poor. And so part of piety, part of religious fulfillment, or personal fulfillment or meaning, or just being in good terms with God, meant that you needed to take an interest in the welfare of the poor. So, throughout the book, and, I think the next stop along this tour was classical Europe, where there are new realizations to be had about the poor, which is that poverty creates a variety of second-order effects on society. It brings crime, it brings social unrest, it brings epidemic. And so in about 60 different cities throughout Europe through the 16th century, secular bodies of law were enacted to put the secular state in charge of the welfare of the poor, and the assessment of their needs, the determinations of how they could be brought back to self-sufficiency, and trying to find ways to implement those sorts of interventions. So this stuff goes back a long way. I mean, we've been trying to solve these problems of the welfare of complete strangers, for a very long time, and ever since we started encountering strangers, actually. And we've, been coming up with cleverer and cleverer ways of helping them, as the centuries have ticked along.
It goes back to this sort of evolutionary history. Why are we doing that? You mentioned the god kings of ancient city states. It's not clear to me that it was in their personal self-interest to help the poor. Maybe they just, had so much power and just wanted to, because it just made them feel better about themselves, because because they just saw people suffering, and they're already, secure in their power, and have everything they could want, and now they want to help. Alternatively, maybe someone who kept the poor doing, maybe it's more a real politic kind of, if the poor are happy, then they're not inciting rebellion. Um, it's not clear to me if one or both of those explanations are the dominant one there, or but it is clear that there is at least some element of people just trying to help for for the sake of helping.
Yeah, I think your latter explanation is actually the correct one. I think it was realpolitik. The Code of Hammurabi, for example, is the one that is most recognizable to most people. Hammurabi had a lot to gain by trying to prevent the exploitation of the poor, and there were at least two things. One was he generates gratitude and loyalty and docility and harmony and cooperative workforce, and all of those sort of immediately self-interested goodies, glory for him and his lineage going forward, all the kind of cool stuff God kings always want. But also in a society of that sort, which historians of the time call heterarchical societies, there were multiple very strong bases of power. And so, for example, if you think of something like Game of Thrones, those were heterarchical societies. The priestly caste had a lot of power. The royal house had a lot of power, of course. And the elites, aristocrats of the society had a lot of power. So those were competing power bases. So when you limited the priesthood from conscripting the labor of ordinary small farmers, or you prevented aristocrats from loaning money to the poor and vulnerable at extraordinarily high interest rates so that they ended up taking their houses away, you limited those competing power bases from growing their power. So by reducing their power, you end up protecting your own and keeping yourself a contender, as any good God King would want to do. So I think you're absolutely right that these were self-interested reasons. But that they are self-interested, but they end up being in a utilitarian sense good reasons, because they're reasons that ended up, no matter what the motivation was, they ended up making the poor and vulnerable better off. So yeah, absolutely, I'm with you. It was self-interested, but based on reasoning. It was they discovered reasons why it would be worth doing.
Right. And I mean, it's interesting that when people do things for fully self-interested reasons, they're never going to say that. They're never going to say, I did this 100% to secure my own base of power. The reasons you give to others are almost always altruistic. I'm helping the poor because I am kind and generous and wonderful. Yeah, and there doesn't have to be an alignment between the real reasons you're doing things and the reasons you give to others, or even tell to yourself. I think people, we had Robin Hanson on the show. He has a book entitled "The Elephant in the Brain," and it's all about how the reasons we give to ourselves or that we believe about our own actions are not necessarily the real reasons we do things. And it is interesting that that so much of the explicit explanations for our own actions, when we want to make ourselves seem good, are altruistic. Why is that effective? Why do people look at someone who claims to or acts like they're altruistic and see them in a better light than someone says, yeah, I did this good thing, it was for my own benefit?
Right, and you see this through all of history, really. That right up to the present day, we try to motivate people to give out of truly altruistic motivation. So when we see television commercials that feature suffering children who are too sick to get out of bed, or children in the hospital, or widowed, desperate mothers, we keep coming back to first and second order games. At the first order, you are trying to motivate people's sympathy. You're trying to activate this Humean or Smithian sort of construction of how sympathy works, which is awesome. But the second, the higher level game, which is being, arranged by the people who make commercials, is they're saying, look, we need money to make this program go. If we have this money, we can invest in children. We can invest in, building capacity for countries that could develop if they just had the resources. So, and you might be doing that because you genuinely care. You might be doing that because you view it as morally right, whether or not you care in a sense of having sympathy. Or you might view it again as realpolitik. I mean, following World War II, the reason that Great Britain and the United States and our allies decided to try to eliminate world poverty was not simply because they genuinely cared. I mean, I'm sure they did, or they genuinely had moral convictions about it. But it was because, in no uncertain terms, absolutely, explicitly, if we bring these desperately poor countries out of poverty, they will be less likely to be fooled into supporting totalitarians or communists as their leaders. So we were trying to keep the world safe, safe for us, by trying to invest in raising the welfare of people in distant lands. So you can justify these things with altruistic rhetoric, and I think that's great. Let's bring on the altruistic rhetoric. But there are other kinds of reasons that we need to engage with as well, and we always have. The world will be a safer, more secure place. The idea that we're being faithful to moral principles is something that can exist independently of sympathy, actually. You can just come to the recognition that it is not fair that I'm doing so well in life and others are doing so poorly in life just because I happened to be born in North America to, comfortable parents in a middle-class household, and I had plenty of resources and so forth. I mean, there is a deep sense in which that's deeply unfair. It's deeply unjust. And if you come to that recognition, that can motivate you to try to make the world better as well, independently of whether you, in a sense, care in a, Smith or Hume sort of sense. So I say bring on all of these motivations if they're going to, raise the well-being of the desperately poor around the world.
So we're coming up on time. Do you have any closing thoughts, any sort of overall message that you'd like to leave someone with if they've listened to this whole conversation and want to know more?
I think our biggest tool that we've brought to the table to engage our societies in trying to meet the needs of the poor, the poorest and the most vulnerable, either in our own societies or around the world, is reasoning. We have tried to find reasons for how we ought to act. So when we're confronted with suffering, we first ask ourselves, is this something we should do something about, given its secondary effects? And if you, corporately as a society, say, yes, this is something we need to deal with, then we reason with each other about how we ought to deal with it. So we bring ethical insights, we bring religious or spiritual insights to figure out, whether we should. And then we use the tools of science and technology and cost-benefit analyses, and we bring the tools of development economics, and we bring the deliverances of science and technology and trade, and we combine all of these to try to generate interventions that we think are going to make a difference. So the underappreciated psychological capacity, underappreciated endowment we have, is the capacity for reason, for finding reasons, sharing those with others, and letting them consider our reasons, and then working together, reasoning together to figure out what the best way is going to be for making the world a better place. So let's give a shout out to reasoning as a real driver of human generosity over the past few centuries.
My guest today has been Michael McCullough, The book is The Kindness of Strangers, which I'll link to at the show notes page at economicsdetective.com. Michael, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks, Garrett. It was a real pleasure to talk with you.